In the last week of October 1911, a field crew working for the Georgia Geological Survey set up a transit station on a cotton farm in Baker County, on the flat pine and clay country the survey's own bulletins called the Dougherty Plain. Their job that autumn was ordinary by the standards of the office in Atlanta. They were plotting the location and depth of the region's lime sinks, the funnel-shaped hollows where the limestone under the topsoil had been dissolving for thousands of years, for a groundwater bulletin the state geologist intended to publish within the decade. 2 men, a chain, a brass transit, and a canvas satchel of field papers were the whole of the operation, the kind of unremarkable government fieldwork that fills 100 other pages of the same survey's records without incident. They walked the section lines each morning, sighted their instrument on the next fence corner, and wrote down depth, diameter, and drainage direction for every lime sink they crossed. The same 3 columns repeated field after field, county after county, in a hand that stayed neat for pages at a stretch. What is not ordinary is what the survey's own surviving files say happened to the notebook that crew carried that week. It does not say much. The daybook page for the 3rd day of fieldwork breaks off mid-entry, and the next page picks up 3 days later, as though nothing unusual had occurred in between. No explanation sits between those 2 pages. No later insert fills the gap. A government office that recorded rainfall, mileage, and the exact number of feet from a fence post to a sinkhole rim in an era before typewriters were common in the field, left 3 days simply absent and never went back to say why. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What you are looking at, in what remains of that daybook today, is a government scientist's working record from a limestone belt that had already earned a reputation for swallowing things whole. The Dougherty Plain sits over one of the thickest limestone formations in the American South, a bed of soft, water-soluble Ocala limestone laid down when the region was still shallow seafloor, millions of years before a single fence post stood on top of it. Rain falling through the sandy topsoil turns mildly acidic on its way down and slowly eats channels through that limestone below, widening them year after year until a cavity forms with nothing but a crust of soil and root mat holding up whatever sits above it. When that crust finally gives, it does not creak or warn. It drops, sometimes in the space of a single afternoon, sometimes overnight while a farmhouse sleeps a quarter-mile away. Farmers across Baker and Mitchell counties had already lost mules, wagons, and at least 1 recorded well to sudden collapses before the survey crew ever arrived with their chain and transit, and the state geologist's office knew it before it sent anyone into the field. Samuel Washington Macaulay, who led the Georgia Geological Survey for a quarter of a century beginning in 1908, had written plainly in an earlier bulletin that these lime sinks could open in a matter of minutes, swallowing an acre of pasture the way a trapdoor swallows a stage prop, and that the region's farmers had learned through hard experience to build nothing permanent near ground that sounded hollow underfoot. The crew sent into Baker County that October was walking into terrain its own agency had already flagged as unstable in print, years before either man packed his satchel for the trip south. Macaulay's bulletins described the sinks in language closer to a hazard warning than a scientific catalogue, noting the pattern by which cattle, wagons, and once a tenant farmer's smokehouse had gone down without a moment's notice, and advising landowners to treat any patch of ground that rang hollow under a hoofbeat as a place to avoid building on entirely. What the surviving correspondence shows next is a chain of command that moved with unusual speed once word of the incident reached Atlanta. A letter in the survey's outgoing file, dated the following Monday, instructs the crew's supervisor to close out the Baker County station and file a shortened report rather than the full survey originally planned for that township. No cause is given for cutting the work short. The instruction simply arrives 4 days after the daybook's gap begins, addressed to a station that a longer letter earlier in the same file had described as promising for the bulletin's groundwater maps, worth the extra week of measurement the crew had originally been budgeted. A survey that had been treated as a priority became, within a single week, a station to be wrapped up and left behind. The The tone of the correspondence does not explain the change. It gives no weather delay, no illness, no shortage of supplies, the usual reasons a 1911 field office cited when a station closed early. It only shows that the change happened, and happened fast enough that whoever wrote the second letter did not feel the need to justify it to whoever would read the file later, as though the reason were already understood by everyone it needed to be understood by. The supervisor's reply, 3 lines long and filed without comment, confirms the station's closure and requests instructions for the crew's next assignment, and says nothing at all about the notebook, the missing pages, or the ground that had opened beneath the survey's own feet. The physical hole itself did not survive long enough for anyone outside the immediate area to examine it properly. County residents interviewed decades later by local historians recalled a version of events consistent with the timing in the survey's own files, that a new lime sink opened on or near the farm being surveyed sometime in that same week, large enough to take a section of fence line, and, in the telling, that has been passed down through at least 2 families in the area, a satchel of field papers left resting near the collapse's edge. What those same accounts agree on, independent of one another, is what happened next. The landowner, anxious about livestock, wandering into an open pit on his own working pasture, had it filled before the week was out. Wagonloads of fill dirt and broken fieldstone went into the opening on the Friday, according to the family story still told in Baker County at reunions and over Sunday dinners, and by the following Monday the pasture looked, from a distance, as though nothing had ever been there at all. A cavity that had taken perhaps 10,000 years to hollow out beneath that pasture was closed inside of 4 days by 2 men with a mule team and a wagon of broken stone, for reasons that had nothing to do with erasing a government record and everything to do with keeping a cow from breaking its leg in a hole it could not see coming. That is the plain, unglamorous explanation, and it is worth sitting with precisely because it is plain. Nothing about backfilling a dangerous hole on a working farm required any organized effort to hide something. Landowners across the Dougherty Plain did exactly this for decades before and after 1911. Whenever a sink opened somewhere, a plow blade or a wandering calf might find it first. What makes the Baker County sink worth returning to is not that the hole was filled, it is that the filling happened to erase the one piece of physical evidence that could have settled, one way or another, what actually became of the crew's notes. No photograph of the open sink survives anywhere in the survey's files, at a moment when field photography, while not universal, was already common enough in geological survey work that its absence here stands out against the agency's own habits elsewhere in the same bulletin series. No follow-up crew was ever sent to examine the fill material, catalogue what may have gone down with it, or confirm whether the missing pages had truly been lost to the collapse, rather than simply misplaced somewhere on the long ride back to Atlanta. The agency that had built its professional reputation on precise field measurement did not measure the one hole in its own case file that mattered most. It closed the station, filed the shortened report, and moved its crew onto the next township on the map, as though the gap in the daybook were a clerical inconvenience rather than a hole in the historical record itself. One physical trace of that week did survive, and it did not survive inside any government archive. A cast-iron marker stake, the kind survey crews of the period drove into the ground to fix a station's exact position before running their chain lines outward from it, was recovered from the loose edge of the filled ground by a member of the family that still farms that same section of Baker County today. It sat in a barn, half forgotten among plow parts and fence wire, for most of a century before anyone in the family connected it back to the survey's own equipment lists, records that describe stakes of an identical pattern and gauge issued to field crews working the Dougherty Plain in that exact period and no other. The stake is not proof of what happened to the missing notebook pages. It cannot be. What it proves, with a certainty no written record in Atlanta can match, is that a Georgia Geological Survey crew was standing on that precise stretch of ground, at that precise moment in the historical timeline, doing precisely the work the daybook says it was doing, right up until the entries stop. The state's own copy of that week is a 3-day gap between 2 pages. The family's copy is a piece of iron you can still lift out of a barn and hold in your hand. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Baker County Gap is not the only case on record of a sudden southern collapse swallowing a working site and leaving its documentary record incomplete, and setting it beside two better-known and far better documented examples shows how consistent this particular pattern actually is once you know to look for it. In December of 1972, a hole opened in Shelby County, Alabama, on a stretch of land that had already been mined for chert gravel for decades, the same soft carbonate country running under a very different industry than groundwater mapping. Within hours, it had grown to several hundred feet across and well over 100 feet deep, large enough that the local press began calling it simply the Golly hole, a name informal enough to have started as a joke that stuck permanently in the geological literature that followed. The ground beneath that stretch of Alabama sat on the same kind of dissolving carbonate rock that undermines the Dougherty Plain 3 states to the east, and the mining operation working the surface above it had generated its own internal surveys of the site in the years leading up to the collapse, records that state geologists later tried to reconstruct in order to understand exactly how much warning, if any, had existed before the ground finally gave way beneath decades of extraction. Those internal mining survey records were never fully released to the public geological study that followed the collapse. What reached the state's official report was a summary written after the fact, not the underlying survey data itself, and the published report says so directly, in its own plain language, rather than pretending the gap does not exist. State geologists who examined the crater afterward attributed the collapse to decades of chert extraction that had thinned the rock roof below without anyone above ground fully tracking how much support had actually been removed, a slow erosion of margin that no single survey captured in full until the ground itself reported the final total. Houses near the rim were evacuated within hours, and for weeks afterward engineers monitored the crater's edges for further slippage before anyone was allowed to return. 4 decades later, and roughly 500 miles to the southwest, a nearly identical pattern played out along the edge of a Louisiana bayou. In August of 2012, a sinkhole opened near the small community of Bayou Corne, over a salt dome that a company called Texas Brine had been mining for brine since the 1980s, by dissolving underground caverns directly out of the buried salt. One of those caverns had collapsed on itself, and the sinkhole above it eventually swallowed acres of cypress swamp, forced the permanent evacuation of the entire community, and kept slowly growing for years afterward, long past the point anyone expected it to stabilize. The company had been running its own seismic and structural monitoring of that cavern for years before the collapse, monitoring records that became the center of a prolonged legal fight once residents and state regulators tried to determine how early the company had actually known the cavern was failing beneath their homes. Portions of that monitoring data were disputed in court. Portions were released only under sustained legal pressure, years after the ground first opened. To this day, no single public account fully reconciles what the company's own instruments recorded against what state regulators were told, and precisely when they were told it. In the weeks before the ground gave way, residents had already reported bubbles rising through the bayou's surface and a faint smell of natural gas drifting through the swamp, warning signs that were investigated but not, by the company's own later admission, connected to the failing cavern until the sinkhole had already opened and the evacuation was already underway. Set beside each other, the 3 sites share a physical signature that has nothing folkloric about it and nothing that requires a single conspirator to explain. Soft, soluble rock sitting under a working surface, a collapse arriving with almost no warning to the people standing on top of it, and afterward a documentary record that is incomplete not because no one was watching, but because whoever was watching did not fully hand over what they saw. Baker County lost 3 days of a government daybook to a gap nobody ever explained in writing. Shelby County lost the interior survey data behind a mining company's own subsidence estimates, replaced in the public record by a summary written after the ground had already fallen. Bayou Corne lost years of the clearest possible answer to a question an entire evacuated town was asking about the ground beneath its own foundations. None of these gaps required deliberate intention to create them. Understaffed field offices, private companies protecting themselves from liability, and landowners simply doing what farmers had always done with a dangerous hole in a working pasture can explain every one of them individually, without a single hidden hand behind any of it. What is harder to explain away is how reliably the same kind of gap keeps appearing, case after case, exactly where the physical evidence would have been most useful, and exactly when the institutions standing closest to it had the most immediate reason to move quickly and quietly past the question. In each case, the missing material was not destroyed maliciously. It was simply never treated as worth the effort of full recovery once the immediate danger had passed, and that judgment, repeated independently by a farmer, a mining company, and a brine operator across a full century, says something about how institutions weigh a hole in the ground against a hole in the record. The ground is always the more urgent problem. The record waits, and often it waits forever. None of this requires the missing pages from that Baker County notebook to have contained anything more dramatic than rainfall figures and sink depth measurements, the ordinary raw data of an ordinary survey week in an ordinary Georgia county. The gap itself is not evidence of what was written on those particular pages. It is evidence of how completely a physical record can vanish within a matter of days, and how little institutional appetite there typically is to reconstruct it once it has, even when the agency involved has every professional tool it needs to do exactly that. The Georgia Geological Survey did not disappear after 1911, and it did not stop its work in the Dougherty Plain. It kept publishing groundwater bulletins for another 2 decades, describing lime sinks across dozens of other counties in exhaustive, careful, measured detail, station by station, township by township. It simply never went back to Baker County to ask what had gone into the ground alongside that crew's papers, and no later bulletin in the series so much as acknowledges that the question had ever been left open in the first place. The pasture in Baker County looks today the way it has looked for most of a century: flat, grazed, entirely unremarkable to anyone driving past it on the county road. There is no marker showing where the sink opened, no plaque noting that a state survey crew once stood on that exact spot with a transit and a canvas satchel that would not make it back to Atlanta intact. The only object left that still connects that stretch of ground to the week the daybook goes quiet sits in a barn, a short walk from where it was pulled out of the fill dirt, decades after the fact. An iron stake stamped with a pattern the state's own surviving equipment records confirm was issued to field crews working that exact stretch of the Dougherty Plain in that exact year and no other. The hole itself is gone, closed by Friday, the way thousands of lime sinks across that country have been closed before and since, for reasons that had nothing to do with hiding anything from anyone, and everything to do with a farmer keeping his cattle upright on his own land. What the ground took that week, it kept for itself. What the state's own file was supposed to keep, it lost somewhere between 2 pages and never once wrote down why. Somewhere under that cotton and grazing land, sealed inside a century of settled fill, the answer to what actually happened in those 3 days is still sitting exactly where it fell, closer to the surface than anyone farming that ground today has any reason to suspect. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.